Welcome, my friends, to the Trevor Chapman Show. This is Trevor, and this is our place, yours and mine, where we talk and learn from the best minds on this beautiful earth about entrepreneurship, achievement. We are purveyors of the good life, curating environments that promote and even demand Kairos moments of success, happiness, euphoric achievement. I mean, we work relentlessly to attain levels of the highest performance in business and life. Here is to our collective happiness and to celebrating our human experience. My friends, it's time to run. Welcome to the Trevor Chapman Show. This is Trevor, and we are here today with Jake Eagle. Jake, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I've been looking forward to this.
Likewise, Jake. So thank you for jumping on. For the people who may not be familiar listening right now, give us a 60,000-foot overview of who you are today, what you're known for, but especially maybe drill in as well on who you were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and the difference in those 2 or 3 lives, how
Okay.
you've changed.
Let me go back 40 years.
Okay.
So I'm 62. 40 years ago, I was running companies on the East Coast, on the mainland. I ran companies for 15 years, was pretty good at it, had a good reputation, very entrepreneurial, managed different businesses. And my whole world revolved around being productive, performing, learning to be an effective leader. And at the time, because I was pretty good at it, I thought that that was kind of my calling. I thought that was my work. But then in my early 30s, I was pretty unhappy, successful, but unhappy. I went to New Mexico to see a therapist who did these kind of intensives. You'd fly out there and you'd work with him for a week. And it was a phenomenal experience. And the way he worked, I just loved it. He'd spend 3 hours with me. And he'd work with one person in the morning and one in the afternoon. He had a little office on the Rio Grande in the middle of nowhere. And I just thought, boy, this is great. And that led to a early midlife transition. I ended up going back to school. I became a psychotherapist. And then I opened a private practice. I actually moved to Santa Fe to study with this guy. I did a 4-year apprenticeship. And it was just the right thing at the right time for me. Because of my background in business, my approach to therapy was a little bit unique. I would say it was very pragmatic. You know, people would come in and they want to talk about anxiety in their lives. And I would dig into really fundamental things like, how much money are you making? Do you have a retirement plan? Have you got your affairs in order in your life? It was very much related to the world I lived in of business and being productive and building good, solid foundations. And I did that for 25 years. I was a therapist for 25 years. In the beginning, most of my clients were other people that owned businesses because it was an area I could speak their language. Then again, my life looked great. You know, I was successful, had a great practice. My wife had a great practice. She's a homeopath. We were in Santa Fe, nice life, nice everything, but I wasn't really happy. And completely on an instinctive basis, we decided to move. We came to Hawaii and we spent a month here, found a place we fell in love with. Both of us felt 20 years younger when we were here. So we went back to Santa Fe, we put our house on the market, we sold it, and we moved over here. And that was exactly 11 months ago. So we've been here for 11 months. And the result of that change is a completely different way of working with people. And I can get into that, but that's the 60,000-foot overview.
Well, so I'm curious because I've often thought, I have a cousin. He lives in Arizona. And when children are in a domestic situation that they should not be in, that's deemed inappropriate, he goes in and he removes them. And I've often thought about how hard that lifestyle would be. Because you've got both sides of the coin. You're taking the child to a safe place, but the child doesn't know that. They just know that you're removing them from the parent in most instances, and some they recognize the value of it. And I take that and I bridge that over to therapy, where most days people don't come in to say, hey, Jake, I am so happy. Let's talk about how happy and how everything is going well. We tend not to talk with other people when we're fulfilled and content. And so how does that weigh down on your psyche when you're
day in, day out, bombarded with, and I'm probably prostituting it. So I apologize if I am, but I'm not, I'm ignorant in this field. But if people are bombarding you with the negativity from their lives, how does that affect you?
So I think it's exactly the right question. And there's two parts to my answer. The first one is it didn't affect me when I was a therapist because I saw my job as one of accessing and reflecting your health. In other words, your psychological, emotional health. So I didn't feel burdened by your problems. I didn't take them that seriously. It didn't mean that I didn't respect the fact that you may have problems, but I didn't spend a lot of time focused on that. And that gets to what I think is the problem with therapy, which is that it is completely focused on problems. And when the therapist attempts to acknowledge your problems or validate your feelings, I think what they're doing is they're reifying your story, and they are basically taking people in the wrong direction. So what I mean by that is you go in to see a therapist, client comes in and they say, oh, I went home to visit my parents and we're at the dinner table and my mom just totally humiliated me. And the therapist will typically say something like, oh, I'm sorry that happened, or I'm sorry your mom did that to you, which is essentially validating the client's interpretation of what happened. And to me, this is not constructive. I think it's a lot more valuable to point out to people that that's just one way of interpreting what happened. And it may not be an accurate way of interpreting what happened. It's seen through all of your personal filters, but there are other ways of looking at it. So the work that I'm doing now is I've gone even farther away from validating people's problems and hanging out in that space. And I'm really focused on helping people basically be grateful for the lives they have. And the results are much better than the results I used to get.
So it's fascinating because, to give you a little bit of my background, I grew up in Guam in Alaska. We grew up underneath the poverty line. We weren't poor. We were probably the poorest people in our communities. I grew up catching 36 salmon every day so we could make it through the winter, and playing my saxophone on the street so we could pay the mortgage. Oldest of 5 kids, and so I, for whatever reason, and I don't know what it was, had an uncanny amount of joy. Now, that doesn't mean that I didn't experience during each sports season when I had to come up with a reason why I couldn't pay for the jersey this year, that I didn't experience negativity. But on any given day, I remember attempting to feel bad. I remember literally saying, okay, I'm going to be negative right now, because I felt like I couldn't. Like, things in my life weren't perfect, but I was filled with happiness. And I would be like, okay, I'm going to be negative. And I was unable to do it. There was a time in my life, I remember, when I had friends of mine come up and say, I don't like you anymore because you're happy. Now, I got in a habit of being happy. And so when 2008 rolled around, and I'm a young father, a young husband, and I thought I was, the smartest guy on the block, to having all of my self-confidence ripped away because nothing I did worked, I experienced for the first time in my life sadness that was more than momentary. Doom, this sensation that it's all falling apart. I at one point in time thought I need to go get 2 jobs at Walmart because that's all I'm worth. And I stayed in that spot it was very momentary. It was transient, but it got physical. I remember one night I was curled up in the fetal position on the ground because it was just, I could not make payroll. And I had almost 40 employees. And that is a highly stressful situation. And so I grew up believing, my story was, you're supposed to be happy. Men are that they might have joy all the time. I am so grateful for those downturns because it's shaped the framework of my life that I have now. And that is one of gratitude. And I would go beyond gratitude because I attempt to, as often as possible, experience the indescribable sensation of awe, the awe of it all, this thing, this grand adventure, the awe behind the science, that the colors that we see in a beautiful sunrise that may bring us to tears are just constructs of our mind. They don't exist. Those colors aren't there. We create those colors. That the symphony that maybe I'll take my daughter on a date to, one of my daughters, when that music hits us and it moves us, that's just us interpreting particles, nitrogen, oxygen, carbon vibrating in the air that we can't see. And we're interpreting those vibrations as such. And when I contemplate these things and many other things, I experience almost this sensation that is beyond gratitude, for me at least. And I'm far less experienced than you. So, correct me where I'm incorrect, but I experience awe, and the awe keeps me grounded, and it creates a beautiful story. Even when times are tough, it creates a beautiful story for me that I choose to lay as the foundation of my life. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Well, you're a lucky man, because to grow up with the habit of joy is very rare. There are people who have that. My mother had that quality. It's a wonderful way to grow up. And then to have gone through a difficult period of time in 2008, that, the expression that suffering leads to grace, because when we suffer, it's sort of like the rough sandpaper of life, and it leads us to a place that you're describing as awe, where you have this remarkable appreciation. I think what you're describing is exactly the focus my work has taken in the last year, because I too went through a very difficult time. When I moved here, I knew no one. I came with my wife, Hannah, but we didn't know anybody. We had no reputation. We didn't realize how much we had created that supported us in our stories when we were back in Santa Fe. We came here, we were very naive. We came here and had none of it. And for the first time, probably in my adult life, I felt really insecure and lacked confidence. I put myself in a completely unfamiliar place. And that sounds like what you went through in 2008 was pretty unfamiliar. Now, to me, the smartest thing I did is I didn't do what I'd always done before, because I could have gone out and started another business. I could have gone out and started doing free workshops and getting clients and rebuilding my reputation. But I had this awareness that I had done all of that for 25 years, been very busy and preoccupied creating a quote unquote successful life. But there was something missing. I was unhappy about something. I didn't know what. And that's why we came here. So I said to Hannah, I said, let's not do what we've done before. We're both pretty good about going out and making things happen. I said, let's not do it. And so instead of thinking my way through it, instead of trying to be productive, we just I allowed myself to just be in the space and access a different level of consciousness. And that's really the key for me to having found a deeper satisfaction, a deeper joy. And I would agree with you, a sense of awe, which is now what I'm experiencing every day.
So when I left my solar company, what I did not expect, I expected just pure joy because I was so unhappy. And while I had joy, it was intermingled with a incredible sense of loss, which I did not expect. Loss of tribe. And I guess with that, your identity kind of becomes your tribe, right? The story you tell. And that took me a while. I think I'm still trying to create my tribe after losing the tribe that I had spent over a decade building. So was your sensation one of losing your tribe? But you say that prior to leaving, you were already experiencing this unhappiness. So what was the root of that you've come to find?
I think the root of yes to your question, I think that it was a sense of losing tribe, losing status, losing reputation, losing significance. But the root of why I was unhappy, even when I had all of those qualities, and I wasn't miserable, there was just a flatness, there was a complacency in my life. The root of it is that I'd accomplished everything I wanted to, and I was waiting around to grow old.
That
And
makes sense.
yeah, and it felt terrible at 60 years of age, and Hannah is 7 years older. It felt terrible to be sitting around, and I was no longer really ambitious. And so it's like, well, what are we doing?
Oh, that's the worst. Like as you say that, I kind of visualize that in my brain.
And the paradox is that anybody who looked at our life would go, man, if you got it made. What a sweet setup. But there was something missing.
So why is it that we're so unhappy as a culture? But potentially, now we have no way of quantifying this, but we can look at ancient records. And the records don't dictate a group of people that were, in fact, rarely is happiness even talked about. They talk about eudaimonia, tranquility, peace, things like this. Western documents, at least, Athens and, the cultural boom that came from there. But there isn't all this taught. Like when I question 1,000 years from now, you know, when the aliens that come and invade or whatever happens looks at our records, I can be like, wow, and this is a period in time in which culture as a whole struggled to just find peace. I'm going to give you what my interpretation is. Help me understand whether or not it's really the case, and then I'm very fascinated to learn on this. This is my belief. When you have to put food on the table, and each day is a question of whether or not you put food on the table, it's really easy to be happy because all you have to do is put food on the table. It's not like if you have 10 days of putting food on the table in a row, now the bar is raised because it's not a question of whether or not food will be. If I could just make payroll, I was happy. Even if everything else in my life was bad, I was happy because the chorus of needs was met. But once you ascend the hierarchy of needs, what is the quote putting food on the table for people living in a first world nation where food is always on the table, where while people do go hungry, it's harder to go hungry. Why is it that that I meet so many people that are just unhappy? And it's different than unhappiness that I see overseas. I was in Russia and Ukraine for 5 years. Anyone that's been over there knows that there's no shine in their eyes. That's a cultural thing. If you said, "Are you happy?" They'd be like, "What does that matter?" Like happiness, who cares? That has no bearing on anything. But over here, happiness, I mean, man, that's the thing. And so we pop antidepressants, we watch the Kardashians, we, like what is this? Why are we like this?
I'm always embarrassed when people talk about the Kardashians because I don't know who they are, but I feel like
well, I've never watched an episode, so don't worry. But
cool. Right.
Yeah.
So I think my answer to your question is that the vast majority of our lives in Western cultures is spent in what I call safety consciousness. It's that place where we're driven to be productive. We're very time oriented. We're goal oriented. Some of that I think is incredibly valuable and helpful, but it frames our entire world. And I believe that after a certain point, and I think it's much sooner than most people would imagine, after a certain point, we need to shift away from safety consciousness. Once we have the basics covered, we need to shift to what I'm calling heart consciousness, or you could think of it as gratitude consciousness. It's a different state of awareness where we are waking up, looking around and recognizing the beauty and recognizing how fortunate we are, recognizing the miracle of being alive. And it's just an extraordinary situation that we're in, particularly if we're not worried about survival. And people have gotten, I think, very confused. They think about survival, they act like they're dealing with survival, and really what they're dealing with is protecting their identity, protecting their story, but it's not their physical body. And so to me, the key is this shift in consciousness. And then I think happiness becomes a much greater possibility.
So what is happiness? Like biologically, is it just squirts of dopamine and serotonin, and that happens when we think certain thoughts, or like what is it?
Well, yes, it's chemical in nature. I think that it can be something that becomes the background. In other words, it requires very little stimulation. The more present we become, the more we live in a state of what Ram Dass calls loving awareness, the less stimulation we need to get the squirt of dopamine, right? We just have this baseline experience of what I would say is contentment. We see the beauty around us. We feel a sense of satisfaction. And you could translate all that and say maybe that's the rubric called happiness.
So, what are a few of the things that absolutely do not allow that? So, let me give some context. I live in Utah. We moved here simply because we plan on being in California forever. And when our oldest was in first grade, his school was held up 3 times from other kids in K through 5 bringing handguns to school. My wife said, we're not raising our kids here. Luckily, I was able to sell my company. We moved out here to Utah. And Utah has more per capita beauty products purchased than any other state in the union, and per capita has more antidepressants prescribed than any other state in the union. And so I live in a state that is this incredible paradox because you consider the beauty factor and the depression that is just rampant here. Why? In general, not specific to the state, but what is happening that makes us unhappy on a chemical level?
Well, it's interesting that you said that you have the highest per capita use of antidepressants because Hawaii, which is where I am, has the lowest per capita use of antidepressants. And as I said, my wife's a homeopath, so we're very aware of alternative health. And what we see here is a very healthy population. It's interesting. So what leads to the condition you're talking about? When you talked about beauty products, I'm not sure what you meant. What does that mean?
Cosmetic surgery.
Yeah, right. So that goes hand in hand, don't you think, with the need for antidepressants?
So I'm wondering what your take on that is. Why is that?
Um,
So what comes first?
yeah.
Is it because they feel the need to compete with the other beautiful people around them, and because they don't, they're depressed? Or this is, maybe this is a chicken and egg situation. But why am I in the epicenter? I mean, I'm just curious about that. What would your take be on that? If you had 10 people come in and say, I get cosmetic surgery all the time and I'm on antidepressants, what path would you walk down their story that you think the fork in the road led them to this?
I would do the same thing with them that I do with troubled teenagers. I have this metaphor. I can't say I've actually done it, but I would take them to a cabin in the middle of nowhere in the Rockies, lock them in the cabin, and basically say, you want any food, you want any water, ask respectfully, and I'll get you what you need. And we're going to stay here until you appreciate the life you have. Because I think what's happening is when we're spending time on beauty products, cosmetic surgery and things, when we're using antidepressants, we have just gotten so out of touch with life. We're completely off on another path at that time.
How is it possible for us to go back? Is it possible? My kids are growing up in a world that I did not grow up in. They need constant stimulation, or so that's what the world says. So when they get home, electronic free. Like dad has his stuff because he has to work, but you guys are electronic free. My 11-year-old, I just recently helped him. He created a product online and launched a site and was selling it door to door and was selling it on webinars. And he made $4,000 or $5,000 doing it. And so there's small times when we allow electronics, but we have it free. And my kids all read at least 2 hours a night before bed, because I try to create a similar situation for them that I had, because I don't know anything more than I've personally experienced. And I look around and I am in a constant battle, removing layers of unhappiness that are almost flung upon them because of everyone around them. They're the only kids that don't have phones in school and this and that. Can we go back?
I don't know. I do know that what you're doing to me sounds incredibly healthy. And what I believe is that your kids will grow up, at least they have a choice because they've been exposed essentially to 2 different ways of being in the world. You can't live in the world and not be exposed to the cell phone and the electronics, but you're reminding them or showing them that there is another way of being in the world. It's a slower pace. It's more thoughtful. It's more reflective. And to me, that means that they'll be better equipped going forward.
So I've got a couple questions here. I hope that you don't mind. I'm selfishly using this time. I'm notorious for saying the reason why I have a podcast is I can talk to people like you and I don't have to pay $50,000 for an hour to pick your brain. So I hope you don't mind. But hey, birds of a feather, right? And so if it scratches my itch, then others will be interested too. My question is this. I'll preempt it like this. I had a buddy in high school. He said, you'll either be a beach bum or a millionaire when you grow up. And I said, I'll be both. And, for the most part, I fit into one of those two categories on any given day. I either want to walk through the airport completely anonymous, where nothing depends on me. Nothing is falling apart because I'm not there. Nobody needs to get a hold of me. Or I want the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I want to be stopped 10 times to take selfies with people, etc. And so I have these two very distinct aspects of who I am. Now, I've often just contemplated the fact that I have these two very different, like, I don't know what you would call them, within me, desires, because they're desires. And the one that I've been ashamed of for a long time was significance. I am driven by significance. And for years, I tried to minimize that because I was raised to believe that was bad. I should be humble. I should be meek, all of these things. And significance, wow, if I want that, I must innately be bad. I've come to decide that I've got it. I want to be significant. I enjoy it. So instead of spending 50 years fighting my nature, I'll spend 50 years hacking my nature by using my desire to be significant to push me forward to bring joy and peace. So what I seek, my life framework, is tranquility and peace of mind. You can't put any amount of money on peace of mind. Like, you just can't. And so I'll use these desires that I have to bring about for me and those around me peace of mind and tranquility. But I guess my question is my sense of my desire for significance, is that something that I should feel guilty about?
Well, first of all, I don't buy into shame at all. I don't talk about it. I don't believe in it, particularly for adults. I don't think it's a constructive story. And that, to me, it's just a story. So I would encourage you to drop that story. If you want to say that, sometimes you feel a little guilty or a little embarrassed because of the way you're driven by your desire for significance, I would go, okay. But shame is very heavy. Shame suggests that we're fundamentally not an okay human being. It's not that our behavior is a problem. It's that who I am is a problem. So I don't buy into shame. I would drop that from your vocabulary. In terms of significance, what you're doing is a strategy that's pretty smart, which is called utilization. So you have this desire for significance. You might as well utilize it. You might as well utilize it and see if you can find some constructive application, which I think you're doing. Long term, will that desire to be significant continue to serve you well? I don't know. I would say at your age, it's probably really appropriate. And down the road, at a different stage of development, I think it may begin to hinder you because it's harder to be significant. Some people do it, and you may, but it's harder to be significant in your 70s and 80s in our culture. But for right now, you're in your mid 30s, right? Yeah, I think it's right on. Like, hey, embrace it, use it, be conscious of it, and be careful. Be careful that you don't get carried away and lose your humility. And it'll be a balancing act.
So my second thing is intimacy. Like, I have to connect. It's so funny. One of the things that my wife, I often wonder, do I believe in fate or do I not believe in fate? Because some things are just too perfect to have been random. And I'm one of the lucky people that found a girl where it was too perfect to be random. Or this entire experience is like a, what's that movie with Jim Carrey? Truman Show. It's like a Truman Show experience. And like they casted the perfect, woman to be with me. And so I'm lucky in that sense. One of the things she helped me realize is if that as an extrovert, it's not that I want to run around and jump on the table and dance. It's that I feed off of being around people. That's my energy comes from that, which is so odd because as a child, I ran to the mountains to be alone. And I did it almost every weekend. And I found my peace there. I don't know if it was because my home life was a certain way or what it was. But I've now translated that to understand more so it's not just being in a mall with a bunch of people. I thoroughly enjoy intimacy, connection with people. And if I don't have it for very long, it's like I am a off-kiltered boat and my course is no longer true and I take on water. What is that?
Well, sounds like you and I found the same girl. Yeah, I'm incredibly fortunate with who I found to be my life partner. So listening to you makes me think a little bit more about heart consciousness. And sometimes when I work with couples, I sense that they're confused about heart consciousness, which is a state of being open-hearted regardless of what's going on around us. And oftentimes people think they're going to access that through other people, through our partners in particular, romantic relationships. And my contention is that the idea is to access heart consciousness independent of anyone else. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to be in that state of consciousness when I'm around other people, including with my intimate partner. But I don't want it to be dependent on other people. I want it to come from within me. And you clearly have it because you talked about, being young and being in nature. You were alone and you were accessing that quality. You talked about these moments of awe, and some of the ones you described were not dependent on being around other people. So I think it's a little bit of a balance, being able to access that quality and not have it be dependent on other people, but share it with them when you're with them.
I like that. That's so. Do you believe in evolution?
I do.
So do I. When I have a question that is really hard for me to understand, I take the same problem and I go back in time 50,000 years ago. Things were just way more simple back then. Life wasn't easier, but it was more simple. There was far fewer distractions. And I believe that I am the culmination of what worked for millions of years as Homo sapiens, what worked tribally, collectively, less individually. Like, because it was really, when we find skeletons, they're usually off individuals that died alone. It was really hard to survive without the unit, without the tribe. So much of what we do is we fit into a tribal structure. We're almost designed for that. And I make sense of my world today by considering the Trevor Chapman, the great, 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 great grandfather, more greats than that lived back in the day. I think also that a lot of the confusion arises from the fact that I'm not fighting off saber-toothed tigers today. I'm not kicking people out of my tribe today who could potentially ruin it based on their actions or their inauthenticity, their lies, whatever the case may be. And I think because of that, I think because we're all wired that way. I mean, let's just face it. We are a series of miracle after miracle after miracle. Not just that we were born, that's a whole separate thing, but that great great granddad didn't fall off that cliff, and that his son didn't die of a fever before he had a kid, and that kid wasn't eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, and that the Black Plague didn't take them out, and on and on and on and on. Consider the serendipity that had to occur over millions of years, and it's all culminated in me and you. And I think that also confuses us today because we're wired to operate in a different system than we are operating in now. Do you consider that? Have you considered that?
Yeah, I buy it 100%. It's how I work with couples. Couples come in for therapy, and a lot of their challenges and problems are because they don't accept their biological heritage. They don't recognize the function of what I call the primitive brain. And the primitive brain is active, powerful, and has a lot of conditioning that is carried forward. We've arrived at a time when people are using the other part of the brain, what I call the modern brain, the neocortex, the prefrontal cortex, with all these ideas, all these concepts about who we should be and about how we should be and about what our identity is and how we should be politically correct and how men and women should have equal roles in a relationship. But there's another part of our brain that's going, no, that's not going to work for me. And so I think we need to acknowledge them as you just have and say, this is part of the human experience. It's not good or bad, but it shouldn't be denied.
So how do you see that playing out then? So a couple is having a problem. Like 80% of the problems are what? I once read that people get divorced either because of money or sex.
Yeah, I think those are the surface manifestations. The basic problem, if I were to boil it down, is it's kind of it's projecting onto the other person and getting my sense of self from her. And
Mm.
when what she reflects back isn't what I want, then I get mad at her.
Hmm.
And now we're in a power struggle. I'm going to try to get to have her reflect back a me who I want to be.
Oh, wow. Wow.
And so one of the things that we teach in our programs is it's called perception language. It's a different way of talking where I make completely clear when I'm talking about myself or when I'm talking about my projection of you. I'm never talking about you, ever. A lot of times, though, I'm talking about my projection of you. And if I make that really clear, then, and people are doing this in a couple relationship, then they stop confusing themselves. They stop thinking the other person is telling that. I stop thinking you're telling me about me, because you're never
Mm-hmm.
telling me about me. You're always telling me about yourself.
I'm still wrapping my head around that. That's so fascinating. Yeah, my projection of you. I'm talking about myself. Yeah, it's so funny. A few days ago, so we've been gone for like a month on various trips and spring break for the kids and everything like that. And kids had their own room in the hotel, and I was talking with my wife, and I was just like, it's fascinating that you and I can communicate beyond the fact that these are just sounds that we're making with this tissue, this biological tissue. But okay, if I see a dog and I identify that as a dog and I point it and I say, dog, we get that. These objects, no problem. We can communicate on that. But when we step into the realm of ethereal, what it means, what honesty is, what sacred is, all these concepts that don't have a physical manifestation that we can even share thought about, that blows my mind.
Yeah, and what blows my mind is the fact that the world works, that it actually goes around, because people miscommunicate so often. It just astounds me that we accomplish the things we do.
Absolutely. So I may be getting these words wrong, but which one is good and which one is bad? Codependence and interdependence. Codependence is when you rely on the other person to validate you, give you a sense of self. And interdependence is when you have the ability to depend on someone, but you totally depend on yourself. Am I correct with
Exactly
that?
right. Exactly right.
So we want to be interdependent.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And the key in particularly intimate relationships, but this is true in friendships as well. The key piece that, in my opinion, most couples I've worked with don't get is that before we can be interdependent, we need to separate. And so I'm always saying to couples who are having tension or power struggles, you have to separate. You have to separate. You have to recognize you're two separate individuals. And then the key is to turn toward one another. What typically happens is people get enmeshed, codependent, they get enmeshed. It's all completely confusing, the dynamic, because I think you're telling me about me and you think I'm telling you about you, and we just can't sort things out. So we just start to hurt one another and create scar tissue, and that to me is really damaging. I always treat my marriage as if it's sacred. I treat it as if it's tender. And as a result of treating it that way, it becomes robust because there isn't a lot of scar tissue. Hannah and I are very careful the way we talk to one another. We've never been really harsh. You know, we had our fights, we've had our share of fights, and we've called each other some names, but it's pretty careful. We're pretty careful about how we talk to one another. But let me go back to my point, which is if we can separate and recognize we're separate, and a lot of times people do that, and then they turn away from each other. That's the mistake. Want to recognize we're separate. You don't control my emotional well-being. You don't control my nervous system. I do. So if something happens, I'm not a victim and you're not the perpetrator. I mean, not unless you smack me in the face, right? It's kind of like today, I don't know if you even know this, but you and I there was this confusion about scheduling, and I showed up an hour early. Doesn't matter why. But, I could have gone to the place of, look at what you guys are doing to me. And then I victimize myself. You become the perpetrator, and I hold you responsible for my problem, my anxiety, whatever it is that I go through. And as soon as I do that, I've given my power away, and I'm projecting all sorts of stuff on you, and it makes it really hard for you and me to connect.
Yeah. Well, I apologize first off for the confusion.
Yeah, it was a non-issue. I got to play my new Hong drum for an hour, so thank you.
Oh, awesome.
And actually, it's a funny example because things happen in life, and the question is, when at that moment where I realized your schedule and mine didn't meet up the way I expected, then the question is, what do I do about it? I have a choice. And go back to the couple dynamic. They're having this tension. They have to pull apart, realize they're separate, and then turn towards one another and say, what do we want to do right now? What do we want to do in the next 5 minutes? This, to me, is the best single question Hannah and I learned 20 years ago. Whenever we had conflict or tension, pull apart, turn towards one another and say, what do we want to have happen in the next 5 minutes? Do we want to have a fight? Do we want to disconnect? Do we want to reconnect? Do we want to remember that we're best friends? And 99% of the time, we would choose to reconnect. Once in a while, one of us would want to have a fight, and that was usually me because I was immature, but it was rare.
That I'm writing that down right now. That's really good.
And by the way, great to use this with your kids too, because what it does is it takes them out of the feelings they have about what happened, and it invites them to step into what is it they want to create in the next 5 minutes. I want to say one more thing. When I say takes them out of the feelings they had, I don't mean to suggest we want to repress the feelings. So they have their moment of expressing what's called a primary emotion. You're angry, you're sad, you're fearful, you're joyful. Those are the primary emotions. Those emotions only have a life of about 90 seconds. That's it. That's it. The chemicals that are produced will be in your system for 90 seconds unless you start telling a story. If you start telling a story about whatever it is that happened, now secondary emotions come in and they take on a life of their own, and they can last for decades, literally decades.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
And it's kind of why I said to you, Trevor, drop the word shame. I mean, it's my own thing, but I'm recommending to you because shame is a huge story, and it's not a useful story.
I will 100%. So this is an interesting segue. How many adults are hung up on their childhood, and why? As an example, growing up, my dad would often refer to his childhood very unpleasantly, and I could see that it was a part of who he was as an adult. It, on a daily basis, affected him. Now, when I met my wife, she kept saying this phrase, people need to be a transitionary character. And I considered it so much. And she must have said it so much because I was following in the footsteps of my dad. And I remember a day and age when I thought to myself, wow, I don't even consider, because I used to think, oh, if my parents had done that, if my parents had done this, I would have turned out this way or that way. My life would be like this, blah, blah, blah. It's nowhere in my mind. I recognize the lessons that I learned from all aspects, and I appreciate that. And I think it was that phrase, be a transitionary character. But that hit me when I was in my early 20s. And I feel like the older we get, the more in a rut we tend to operate. So childhood issues, like what are they? Are they literally ingrained in our brain mush and we can't get over them? Or are we looking for resolution as adults with them? What is it?
Yeah, so I think I think this whole thing is a mythology, and I'm kind of going out on a limb here. But other than traumatic events, which create an impression that we can't release, and people way overuse the word trauma. People have a fight and they go, it was traumatic. Well, it wasn't traumatic unless you got run over by a truck. So I think that with Freud, for the last 100 years, we have been accentuating the issues of childhood and creating an entire industry and an entire mythology and meme around needing to resolve childhood issues. I'm going to suggest it's about the same as saying that the earth is flat. And when we realized the earth was not flat, all sorts of new possibilities arose and opened up. The whole world changed. And I think the same thing is true. I think that, and I'm really speculating here, but I'm thinking somebody who had a difficult childhood, modestly difficult childhood, maybe they need a couple years of therapy. Maybe they need a couple of years where they get to introspect, they get to understand their point of view, the other person's point of view. They learn some basic cognitive lessons. They learn some coping skills. They learn some communication tools. And I'm going to say that's about it. You're ready to move on. You're ready to go on beyond therapy. I now call myself a meta therapist, not a therapist, because I don't want to contribute to that myth that we're constantly needing to work out historical issues. And I love your wife's expression, a transitional character. I think it's exactly right. We each have what I call an identity. Some people call it the ego. I don't call it the ego because ego's kind of gotten a bad rap. So I call it my identity. I carry it with me wherever I go. It's constantly changing and evolving and morphing. And if I resist that, which I do, by the way, when I hold on to a story about my childhood, I'm limiting myself. And so I really am placing less value on people who want to resolve and work through childhood issues, placing more value on developing the ability to maturely express myself, whatever I'm feeling, and the ability to live in a state of presence. As soon as I start telling you about what happened to me when I was 11 years old, I'm no longer in presence. I'm in some story that happened 50 years ago.
Well, do we revert to that because it gives us significance? Now I have a problem, and so we're significant, and it's so out of grasp that it's a problem that can't, it's just like, snap, I'm hungry, here's your food. That problem is solved. You're no longer significant because you're starving. But this thing is so out there. It's so misunderstood that people get their significance from their childhood, quote, issues that are misunderstood, or why do we?
Well, I think it's become a cultural meme. We actually believe we need to do it. And the reality is, you said, I'm hungry, have some food, snap, and I'm back. And I love what you just said, because I have been practicing identifying my story. And the way I say it, and it was before I heard what you just said, the way I say it is I'm going along, and my story tends to be what I call a worry story. I tend to be a worrier, not warrior. So, so I'm going along through my day, and all of a sudden I start to worry about something, and I say, that's my worry voice. And I go, snap, and I'm right back here. And it's that immediate. And the only time I can't do it is if I'm really depleted, like if I'm feeling sick, or if I'm in pain, or if I'm just having a really hard time. I've kind of worked myself up. Other than that, for the last several months, it is as effective as giving food to a hungry person.
Wow. So this thing right now, you and I speaking, it's purely plausible that I'm a construct of your imagination, but I think I'm not. What is this to you? This life, reality? Like, what is it?
Well, so you and the conversation we're having, for me, there's four of us in this conversation. There's you, there's me, there's the you that I'm projecting onto, and there's the me that you're projecting onto. And if we can stay clear about all of that, I think you and I can have an incredibly healthy, productive connection that's supportive and helps each one of us be clearer about, this sounds funny, but be clearer about our own hallucinations. Right?
Yes.
I'm hallucinating all the time. And you, or my dear friend who passed away a year ago, the reason he was such a dear friend is he could reflect back to me that I was hallucinating. And he did it in a respectful, loving way. He wasn't diminishing my ideas. He was just saying, it was like saying, maybe, maybe not.
That's interesting. So what is your take then on how do you understand reality?
I understand that it is best captured in this simple expression, which is nothing means anything other than the meaning we give it. Nothing means
Nothing means
anything
anything other
other
than
than
the
the meaning we
meaning
give it.
we give it. Huh.
And so I am constantly constructing my version of reality all the time. And if it doesn't work for me, I better learn how to change the meaning that I give to things.
I'm writing this down real quick. Other than the meaning we give it.
And sometimes people will say, well, does that mean that I can make up meaning of any situation in any way I want? And my answer is no. I mean, there are people that we can have intimate relationships with that are, it's easy to make wonderful meaning. It's easy to make meaning in a way where we nourish ourselves. Then there are people I could have an intimate relationship and it just would be impossible for me to make meaning in that way because the chemistry is wrong and our styles are wrong and our vibe is wrong. So I'm not saying that I can make up anything with any fodder that you give me. I need to go out and get the right fodder and then make meaning of it in a way that makes my life constructive and vibrant.
That's fascinating. I was recently driving back with my son from a trip that we were on, and we were listening to this podcast, Hardcore History by Dan Carlin. I love it. This one I got a little bit in trouble in because it's a little bit bloody, and he's 11, so I got the backhand. Anyway, in it, he talks about medieval torture and death, and how in the 1500s, before Martin Luther, etc., when it was still a church-controlled state entirely, that parents and children would show up for death sentences, and that it was this beautiful thing altogether where the person that was being tortured to atone for their sins would sing a verse while they were being skinned alive or whatever the case may be. And I don't want to go into detail because this isn't supposed to be an explicit podcast. But things far worse than that. And they would sing and cry. And then the audience would come in and they would sing the next verse. And then the person whose life was being prolonged, because death wasn't the sentence. Death was just inevitable. The sentence was the torture. That was the judgment. And as this continued, it was a spiritual experience, and that there are recordings, written text, where the child and the parent would walk away in the spirit of like a religious sensation of truth.
Yeah.
What do you think?
So they experienced awe in those situations.
Awe, yes, they experienced awe.
And it's the perfect example to illustrate what I said. Nothing means anything other than the meaning we give it.
Isn't that interesting? Oh,
it's all sorts of things, right? It's brilliant, it's scary, and it's inspiring.
So what do you think happens then when we die? What's your take on death?
Well, I don't know. My mentor of many years, he was 85 when I met him. He died at 92, but he had died at 80. He had a heart attack. He died. He was dead for 5 minutes. They brought him back. And I said to him, what's the deal? And he said, nothing there. Nothing there. Now, he's kind of a scientist, and he probably had that leaning anyway. But I don't know. I don't know. All I focus on is how I live. My main thrust is about my conduct every day. It's all about how I conduct myself. And
that's so good.
Death will take care of itself.
Yeah, and that's so good. And I'll tell you what my philosophy is. I believe that abusing the present for a gift that may come later is absolutely prostituting this fleeting moment of life that we have. In other words, if I do everything right now so that I can later enjoy heaven, is that really heaven? So here's a few things for me. Number one, let's say that I get to, quote, heaven, and I'm there without the people that mean things to me. Well, it's not heaven to me. So first off, heaven is not a place, it's society, it's who you're with. But if I sacrifice this entire life doing things I don't want to do, I'm not talking about running around and selfishly doing things, ravaging everything and whatnot. No, I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about almost setting this life aside as a horrible domino because of dominoes that fell before me. And I have to live through this. And it's supposed to be torture. And it's supposed to be this atonement for whatever the case may be, so that one day I can be happy. In my mind, I can't rationalize that. Like, it's hard for me to accept that. And so what you said about focusing only on this moment, that is so powerful. And I believe that if we get to heaven or whatever, pop up as some consciousness somewhere and whatever the case may be, that's how we do it.
And let's take death out of the equation for what you were just talking about. People do what you just described all the time. They get into relationships with somebody where it's difficult and painful, and they talk about the fact that they're growing spiritually because their partner pushes their buttons. And they'll stay in relationships that are difficult and challenging and hard for years, thinking that they're paying some due, they're learning some lesson. And one of the things Hannah taught me years ago was that love can be easy.
That's awesome.
Yeah. You don't need to have hardship to learn and grow. I'm not saying that it's never useful, but the idea that life has to be difficult so that I can enjoy something later, I don't buy into that.
Love can be easy. That is so incredible. Someone said a similar thing not too long ago. Tim Ferriss, who I'm a fan of, went through a midlife crisis at 40. He was freaking out. And he writes that he needed answers. And so he's going to try to put together his answer to get these mentors together. It was like, I'll write a book, New York Times bestseller. They'll answer all my questions for me. So he constructed this thing. Now, I have this philosophy, Jake, and I put out a video about it. I'll send it to you. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not. It's a framework that works for me. I've identified that there are people who do things and there are people that don't. And the ones that don't are usually a perfectionist and a procrastinator, usually both. A perfectionist takes a simple concept and turns it into the ideal outcome, Rome after 1,000 years, as opposed to a little settlement now. And unless they can achieve it, they don't start, which makes them a procrastinator who wants a guarantee in a world that does not give guarantees that the ideal outcome will occur. And so when Tim Ferriss wrote that it was overwhelming him, so all of a sudden this thought popped into his head. What would it look like if it were easy? Not that it is, but what would it look like if it were easy? And he said, well, it would be as simple as writing a few emails, getting their responses back and compiling it into a book and getting on the New York Times bestseller list. And he said, well, that's what I'll do then. And he did it.
I love it.
Yeah. So that's fascinating. Love can be easy. That is so good. So kind of tailing off now, kind of getting to a point where we wrap up. What is your truth aside from what you've shared? Like let me say it this way. When life got hard for me in 2008, I sat down and I said, okay, I now realize that we're not always supposed to be happy. Why was I utterly ill prepared? Why? And we play the blame game and the rationalization game and the justification game. And that's what I was doing. And I was rationalizing that this was happening to me, not because of me. And in that rationalization of me not being the actor, but being acted upon, I said, if my predecessors would have given me a book on life, the guide of how to live, expect disappointment because it will come, but it will come as easily as joy will come, all these little truisms, right? And I was wondering where that book was. And I've now kind of got it in my own head, and I choose and believe that the place that we are supposed to be is a place of action, acting. Nothing happens to us that we don't allow. It's exactly what you say. Nothing means anything other than the meaning we give it. And so anything good that happens comes because of you, and bad things happen because of you. And there's some things that are outside of our control, but really, how much is really outside of our control? I mean, what are the pills called that have sugar in them and they heal your cancer?
Placebo.
I mean, yeah. So that proves how much really happens outside of our control. So all of that aside, your book of life, what is it?
Well, I agree.
How did you summarize
I agree with you. It comes down to action, but I think it's the kind of action. And I would summarize it with a Rollo May quote. He said, "Does not the uncertainty of our time teach us the most important lesson of all? That the ultimate criteria are the honesty, integrity, courage, and love of a given moment of relatedness. If we do not have that, we are not building for the future anyway. And if we do have it, we can trust the future to itself." Honesty, integrity, he says courage and love. I actually don't believe in courage. I believe in kindness. But so I would say honest. If I conduct myself in every moment of relating with honesty, integrity, kindness, and love, I trust the future will unfold in a beautiful way.
I have a friend, his name is Jesse Elder, and I've had him on the podcast 5 times. And each time the file corrupts. It's the only time it's ever corrupted. He's a little bit woo-woo, and so he thinks it's because, we're talking about stuff that maybe we're not supposed to or something like that. Who knows? I'm not one to judge, but he believes in this concept I'll explain by allegory. If he were to say, you ask him, what is life? This is what he says it is. If you put on a virtual reality goggles that are virtual reality, and you start playing a game, your attention is on the game, but you're aware that there's life outside of it. However, when you look around, your attention is fully in the moment while being aware that there's something else. You take off the goggles and you look around, and again, you're like, okay, wow, this isn't life. This is just where my attention is, this other thing. He then says, now imagine that you're in a football stadium. And when you take them off, there's hundreds of other people around you, 10 feet away from you in all directions, quadrant like. And they're also in this simulation. And their attention is also on the game, but they're aware that they're in a football stadium, etc. And then you walk over and you tap on one of their shoulders. And when they take off the goggles, you look at them and it's you. And they're all you. And what he means by that is he takes quantum physics and he says, these truths that we found that are hard to comprehend, you look at a particle and it changes the way it acts from a wave to a particle to all this crazy stuff. And we can literally take a proton and make it disappear here and appear in space, all this crazy stuff that we're doing now that it's hard to comprehend. We just know that it happens. So this is what he does. In a moment of, I wish I remembered the word, time-piercing meditation is what he calls it. He closes his eyes and he goes away. And he assumes that simultaneously, there is no time, but simultaneously, an infinite number of lifetimes of him are occurring. Not only now, but a Jesse Elder that's 250 years old. And he finds the best, most ideal 250-year-old Jesse Elder, the best thing that could have happened, the environment, what he's achieved, how he feels, all of that. And then he says, okay, now I simply work back from that, and that informs me of the next slide in the progression of the slides of life. And that's how he lives, his version of honesty, kindness, integrity, etc. And he believes that. And he was once unhappy, and he's very happy now, full of joy.
Well, part of what he's doing, from my interpretation of what he's doing, is he's accessing what I call spacious consciousness, finding a truth for himself, bringing it back to the now and using it to guide him. I think it's extremely smart.
Well, so what do you mean by that? Help me understand that a little bit better, the spacious consciousness.
So I've referred to most of us living in safety consciousness. I've advocated that we learn to live in heart consciousness more of the time. And then the third realm of consciousness that I work with is called spacious consciousness. And it's a state of timelessness. There really are very few words to describe it. It's a very expanded state. It has an all-knowing or all recognizing quality. It's odd in that you recognize, but you don't label. It's a state of pure awareness. And if I access that state enough, I affect my neural pathways. I then come back into the life of today, the time of today, but I come back with a wisdom. I come back with a comfort. I come back without anxiety around death. I come back without anxiety around uncertainty. And this allows me to live more fully in the present. And I have a sense that that's part of what he's doing through that time-piercing meditation.
So is it possible to visit that state without like hallucinogens and whatnot?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. It's possible to do it. And I think it's relatively easy, relatively accessible. I was never a good meditator, and I started working on a particular meditation about 2 years ago. And the first period of time was very difficult for me, but then I actually accessed this state. And since I've been able to go there with relative ease. And the way I accessed it was kind of fascinating, but I also don't know if we're running out of time or not. So
I would love to hear it. If you have the time, I have the time.
Yeah. So as I said, I was not a good meditator. I have a very busy mind, but a few weeks before this event, this meditation that was so profound, I got news that my best friend had pancreatic cancer. And the night before the meditation, I was so upset, I really couldn't even sleep. I got up the next morning just exhausted and thought, really, there's no point in going to the meditation other than I said I would. I made a commitment. So I went. I thought it was going to be a waste of time. started to meditate, and I was so tired. I think my defenses were so low that I just found myself having an experience unlike any I'd ever had before, where I accessed this state of spacious consciousness. And from there, not only did I have the perspective that Jesse was talking about, the lifetimes, the 250 years ago me, the 250 years into the future me, the all of me's that have died, all of the loved ones in my life who have come and gone, the waves coming on the shores, splashing and crashing and going back out, and having those be just representations of evolutions of lifetimes. Again, I don't have great words because it's a nonverbal experience, but I came back from that with an acceptance and a comfort with what was happening to my friend, what it meant for me. And essentially, I stayed in that state to a reasonable degree for about 6 months. I don't mean that I lived there all the time, but I had access to it easily for a period of 6 months. I really had no anxiety.
And what happened after the 6 months? Why did access to it change?
6 months later, I had this severe abdominal pain. I had to go to the emergency room, and I lost it. I just went into a state of fear, contraction, panic, and I lost access. And I came out of that, with an urgency to re-experience this. And it took me months before I could re-access that state. And I now have the ability to go there, but I haven't learned or found a way to predominantly carry that quality through my day. I believe it's possible because I did it, but I haven't been able to get back there to the same degree.
So that's so interesting. What is your routine? We are what we think something. Of what we think, we speak less, and of what we speak, we even do less, but it's what we do that kind of creates everything around us. And I know that we're talking about thought here, but we will do thought that then results in these type of events. So when I say think, I'm not talking about the thought action. I'm talking about just the random possibilities that will fly through our mind. So I say all that to say that our routines kind of really structure our lives and they make us. What is your routine?
My routine is to get up in the morning and to make a cup of tea and read anywhere from a paragraph to 3 pages of somebody who I believe had a great mind. And then I go and I do a 20-minute acupressure routine. I do what's called a 4-minute meditation. Then I do an acupressure routine. And then I meditate for 20 minutes. It takes a total of about an hour. If I do it, my day is predictably grounded and intentional, and I'm more likely to be in heart consciousness. If I don't do it, I'm unlikely to catch up with myself that day.
Isn't that interesting? Because we grow up in an environment where none of that is really spoken about. And it's crazy that we have to find this new territory each time. It's fascinating. I don't know if it's entropy or what it is, but
I don't know what it is either. I think it's a little hard to separate it from the momentum of our culture. It's sort of like our conversation about psychotherapy. It has so much momentum that I don't think we can even see it for what it is. And so if we could free ourselves of these habitual patterns, these cultural tendencies, I think that these things that you and I are talking about would not be as difficult as people imagine.
So interesting. Yeah, we are the product of so much. And the key is to not be that. It's to be the intentional, deliberate construction that we desire.
And so when your kids are the right age, and I'm not sure exactly what that is, but introduce them to the idea that nothing means anything other than the meaning we give it. Because I think I've seen children who were raised with that awareness, and they're remarkably independent, and they control their own nervous systems in ways that most people don't.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm sitting here contemplative about all these phrases and these ideas. So Jake, wow. This is I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I've enjoyed this more than a lot of the podcasts. So thank you so much. I would love to follow up in a month or two and and have a further conversation if you're amenable.
It'd be great. I'd love to do it. Two things. One, if I don't know if your listeners ever send you questions, but there may be things you and I can clarify, talk about it again. And then the other thing I want to point out is how much I enjoy how you have shifted into a different state during this call. So I think before we went on the air, you were talking about something going on in Congress and you were all worked up. I don't know, you remember?
I was. I was.
And now you talk about being in a contemplative state. And I love it because I feel like I can really connect with you and I'm enjoying doing so. So it's been
as do
really
I.
nice. Yeah.
Man, Jake, it's been awesome. Thank you so much. How can people find you online and what's the best way for them to engage with you?
Email's the best. Our website is called liveconscious.com. It's not live consciously, it's liveconscious.com. And if people send an email to me, jake@liveconscious.com, I'll always respond. Sometimes takes a few days, but I always get back to people. And then on Amazon, I've got one book on Amazon now called Get Weird. Make the most of your life.
Amazing. Hey, Jake, I just realized I'm going to Hawaii this weekend. I forgot. I'm
Really?
speaking at an event. I don't even know which island it is, but I'll find out. I'll send you a message. And if we're on the same island, let's connect and grab a bite.
Yeah, I'm on the Big Island. So if you're going to be here, we'll do something. We'll go for a spin.
Awesome.
Right.
Very